Great. Our next speaker is Dr. Rishi Chaudhuri. He's an associate professor of neurobiology, physiology, and behavior, and mathematics, and also a core faculty member at the Center for Neuroscience. He is our newest tenured faculty member, which is, as many of you know, one of the biggest major milestones in every faculty member's career. So we're very happy for him and for us. Dr. Chaudhuri got his Ph.D. at Yale and did his postdoctoral studies at UT Austin and a brief fellowship at UC Berkeley. He studies how the brain processes information from a mathematical perspective, utilizing general theoretical principles of neural computation and drawing on information theory, dynamical systems, and machine learning to model specific brain regions and to develop methods to analyze large-scale recordings of brain activity. He collaborates closely with experimentalists and works on mathematical questions that are inspired by larger problems in neuroscience. In 2021, he received a Sloan Research Fellowship, considered one of the most prestigious fellowships given to any young researcher. He's also been awarded UC Davis's Graduate Program Advising and Mentoring Awards from Graduate Studies, recognized for his outstanding dedication to his students. Today, he'll discuss some of his latest work testing an idea to help explain why the brain has redundant connections and how they may be beneficial for memory. So without any further ado, welcome, Dr. Chaudhuri.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming, and thank you for the introduction. So as Marie mentioned, I'm a computational neuroscientist, and so I use mathematical and theoretical frameworks to think about the brain. I actually took a somewhat windy path to neuroscience. I wanted to be a physicist from the ages of about 5 to like 21. I was really fascinated by the stars and molecules. And in the course of my physics studies, I got more and more interested in complex matter. And I remember sitting in a talk watching kind of motor proteins in your cell and just being completely awestruck that these molecules could actually self-organize to do something this exquisite. And so I got more and more interested in thinking about biological matter. And so I went to graduate school to do math, but I knew I wanted to study problems in biology. And I tried working in systems biology, thinking about how bacteria forage, and that was really cool. And I worked a little bit on evolution, trying to model evolution as some sort of random walk. But then my third project, when you try out projects, was modeling learning in the brain. And that felt absolutely right. And I think part of what really fascinates me about brains is they're these physical systems. And so we use the language of physics, chemistry, biochemistry, and so on to think about them. But they're also intelligent systems. So we use the language of function, computation, optimization. And it's this fascinating blend of two languages, two sets of mathematical frameworks, two ways of thinking. And so today, kind of picking up in some ways from themes Karen introduced, I'm going to tell you about a strategy for neural pruning that the brain might use. Trying to answer this question, how do we get rid of redundant connections in the brain while still keeping the important stuff, still hanging on to our learning, still hanging on to our memory? Okay, and so just a brief overview before I get started. I'll briefly introduce so-called pruning, synaptic pruning, which is the process of removing connections in the brain. And then I'll raise what seems to me one of the really key conceptual questions. How does the brain figure out which connections it should actually remove? I'll then take a very slight detour along the way to coming up with the suggested strategy. And I'll introduce the idea of noise or random fluctuations in the brain, and I'll tell you, the brains are surprisingly noisy. And so then I'll put out this idea that maybe this noise plays a functional role. Maybe one of the functional roles this noise plays is helping actually identify which connections we can get rid of. And I'll talk you through a strategy for how to do that. And so then I'll introduce this new algorithm or strategy for how noisy fluctuations in the brain might actually help you figure out which parts of the network are important and should be kept, and which parts of the network can be thrown away. Okay, so let's start out with pruning. And so the brain prunes connections across the lifespan. And so, we go from networks that look like that. I'll show you a bunch of these pictures over the talk. This is an abstract representation of a network of neurons. The circles are the neurons. The lines are supposed to be the connections. And the process of pruning is going from a network that looks like that to a network that looks like this, which has many fewer connections, ideally while preserving the same function. There's lots of fun, tree metaphors in neuroscience, dendrites, trees. And so similarly, pruning, it's a little bit like pruning your tree. Yeah. Pruning, I'll show you a bit more about this in the next slide. Pruning is most dramatic during development, but it continues across the lifespan. Okay, so here's an image that Karen showed a variant of. I stole this one from John Gray, who you might have seen at previous NeuroFests. And this is showing you the number of connections in the brain, the number of synapses on the y-axis. And it's showing you what happens to those over time. And so start out by focusing on this black trace. That's the kind of normal, healthy development and aging. And what you see is there's this early period when your brain is just making tons of connections. My daughter's 18 months old. At this point, her brain, I think, is making about 1 million synapses per second. I saw that number. I was looking up. I was preparing to give this talk. This is the number I have in my head. I was like, there's no way that's right. And so I spent a bunch of time trying to fact check that. You can calculate how many connections the brain needs to make, how many seconds there are in the first 3 years, and it totally lines up. It might even be an underestimate. 1 million per second is just, I can't even imagine that. And so the connection goes up, you make a whole bunch of connections, and then your brain starts pruning them. It starts to get rid of some of these extra connections. And so it's like, you move to a new town, you make all these new friends, and then you figure out, who your real core group is. And so the brain has made all these extra connections, and now it's pruning. It's kind of focusing on the important ones. This happens to different degrees in different brain regions. In the prefrontal cortex, it seems like maybe half or more of these connections are removed. And so really a lot of connections are being removed. And so, and kind of part of the theme is removing connections is often a good thing. You want to focus on the important ones. Okay, so you make a whole bunch of connections. That black line goes up. It's kind of covered by this one, so you can't see it too well. And then it starts to decay, and then it mostly stabilizes across the lifespan. But it still moves around. Okay, so that's what we think of as kind of a traditional trajectory, but there's a lot of evidence that both the density of connections and more specifically this actual process of pruning is disrupted in both neurodevelopmental and neurodegenerative diseases. And so for example, as Karen mentioned, if you look at this trace, which is density, number of connections in schizophrenia, there seems to be a bunch of evidence that pruning processes in adolescence there's too much going on. And so you lose too many connections, and that kind of pulls you down. Also, as Karen mentioned, in Alzheimer's, you kind of see, you've got kind of normal densities, and then it seems like there's possibly too much pruning, and it really declines. There's some speculation, in fact, that this might involve sort of reactivation of the same pruning mechanisms from adolescence, just later in life. And there's something sort of poignant that this kind of terrible disease towards the end of life might effectively use some of the same mechanisms as healthy adolescent development. There's also, and these are kind of more tenuous connections to pruning and autism and related disorders. But so really all of that is to say that this process of pruning is essential for development and for lifelong health. Okay, so that's kind of on this macro long time scale. But on a much faster time scale, pruning, getting rid of connections, seems to be crucial for learning. And so I took these images from one of Karen's papers. And as Karen told you, that the connections between neurons are very, very dynamic. They're changing on the time scales of minutes to hours. And so these are 2 pictures from her papers showing these little spines, these connections, actually disappearing, going from the blue filled circle to the blue empty circle. And it seems like this is not just random noise. There have been studies that look at the learning performance in rodents. And in their settings, they find that the performance on some task, the learning, doesn't just depend on the new connections you made. It also depends on successfully getting rid of all unnecessary connections. And so over here on the x-axis, they're showing you how much you've gotten rid of. The y-axis, they're showing you performance. The graph goes up. And so that means you do better the more connections you've got rid of. And so performance is, pruning is very important for learning as well. I don't have time to go into this, but pruning we also think is important for efficiency. Connections are expensive. And there's actually a lot of interest now in pruning in machine learning and AI as a way to build more efficient artificial neural networks that don't have as many connections. I'm happy to chat about that if you have questions. Okay, so I've given you, kind of a brief introduction to this process of pruning, of removing connections in the brain. And as a computational neuroscientist, I'm trying to look at general principles. And when I look at a process like this, it feels to me that the key question is, which connections do you actually prune? Because you want to keep the important stuff and get rid of the unimportant stuff. But how do you know? So here's, again, a very simple picture of a neural network. The circles are meant to represent neurons. The lines are meant to represent connections. And just looking at this network, you see, well, you had better keep that connection. That connection is the only way the left group can talk to the right group, right? So we really don't want to get rid of that. On the other hand, maybe that connection over there, there are plenty of ways for these two neurons to talk to each other indirectly. If we were going to get rid of something, let's get rid of that. Okay, but how do we know? We can't just say which connections are strong, which connections are weak. Because as we know across fields, weak links can be really important. There's all this groundbreaking work in sociology showing that the way people find jobs, for example, often depends on these weak ties. And so having these weak connections can, in fact, be really, really important. At the same time, strong connections can be redundant. Me and my best friend probably have a very strong connection, but we also have a lot of friends in common. I could probably influence them and be connected to them through all of those other friends. So I'm not going to get rid of my best friend, but just because a connection is strong doesn't mean that it's the only way for information to flow. There's plenty of other ways for information to flow. And so really the broader principle is that the importance of a connection between two neurons doesn't just depend on the strength of that connection, it depends on the structure of the network as a whole. It depends on how information flows through the network. Okay, but how does each pair of neurons know this? It's, these two neurons are connected. It's a very local thing. It's not like they can go and look in the rest of the brain and say, oh, information could flow from me to you, to you, to you, to you, and back. And so there's this key conceptual or theoretical problem. How do they figure this out? Okay, so that's the problem. And I'm going to take a slight detour along the way to introducing a proposed solution. And it's a theoretical, it's a proposed solution, it's a new idea. We don't know that the brain actually does this, but we have to find out. Okay, and so the slight detour is I'm going to tell you that brains are surprisingly noisy. There seems to be a lot of randomness, a lot of fluctuations in the brain at kind of every level. So this is a figure from a nice review looking at this across scales. But everywhere from the super molecular level, single cells, electrical currents in cells, lots of noise there, all the way up to noise in just how I move my arm, noise at the whole level of whole networks of neurons, big fluctuations just of activity, electrical activity over the course of the brain. And so there's a surprising amount of noise and randomness across scales in the brain. Just to make this concrete, here's an example that I find particularly compelling. On the left is a schematic of how I was taught information transmission in the brain worked. You have a source neuron, that's that kind of squiggly object at the top, a target neuron at the bottom. And when this source neuron tries to send a signal, in fact, maybe I should use this. There's some electrical impulse that travels down the nerve, comes to the end, to the synapse, and neurotransmitter is released and goes and tells this target neuron, hey, I'm sending you a message, change your state. But it turns out that this process often fails. It's very often the case that this electrical signal is sent, and then sort of nothing happens. The message doesn't make it across. To me, this is pretty weird. Communication in the brain is expensive. This kind of electrical signaling is expensive. It chews up a very big part of just our entire energy budget. Making synapses is expensive. These are like, exquisite structures, as Karen showed you, lots of proteins, like a lot of energy is going into this stuff. Why build a really expensive communication system that fails a lot? It's like, buying a super expensive cell phone and then using it with a really terrible plan. And maybe some of you are in that situation, but biology can be extremely robust when it wants. Like, a lot of genetic mechanisms basically are already pushing the boundaries of the laws of physics. They're so precise. And so when biology is sloppy, it's often because it's thought things through. This process, actually, kind of a fun aside, the synaptic failure process. John Eccles, who was a Nobel Prize winner, thought that this was the explanation for free will. That's beyond the scope of my talk, but it's kind of a fun, after a couple of glasses of wine topic. Okay, but this is noisy. Why do this? So kind of a broader theme that I've been exploring in my research is trying to understand whether randomness and noise can play a role in computation. This is actually a really big theme in modern computer science algorithms. It turns out having some degree of randomness, some noise, actually is a very powerful computational resource. This is no surprise to biologists. The biological algorithm is evolution, and evolution runs on random mutations. Now, imagine that you have some population of organisms. They have some random mutations, so some of them are lighter, some of them are darker. Now this predator comes along, it's looking for who to eat. Well, you can see the dark ones really well, so it eats them. And so these ones survive. You've just taken randomness, you've used randomness to explore a space of possible strategies, and then the environment has selected some of those. And so having the randomness has actually given you a way to develop more fit organisms. But this is one example, but this theme shows up a lot. Okay, so brains are noisy. Interesting question, why they're noisy. And one possible function of this noise I'm going to suggest is that noise allows the brain to prune redundant connections, to identify redundant connections and then prune them. And so now I'm putting these ideas back together. Okay, so to kind of describe the idea, I'm going to need to tell you a little bit about how we think about networks of neurons. And so again, here's a network of neurons. You can think about these neurons as sending messages. Let's focus on one of these neurons. It's a very abstract depiction. And let's talk about what each neuron in this network is doing. So we're just going to zoom in on that. Okay, so this is this neuron. It gets some inputs from other neurons, and it sends some outputs to other neurons. Inputs, outputs. It has connections. These are the synapses that Karen and I have been talking about. And the strength of the connection is roughly the influence of the message. And so this neuron really listens to the message from this neuron, doesn't really care about this neuron, but will maybe hear it out a little bit and so on. And when it sends its message along, it has a big influence in this neuron and a small influence on that. Okay, and so what each neuron in the network does is it gets all its messages, it gets all its inputs, it adds them up, and it transforms them a little bit, and it passes that along, right? And so this neuron's adding up its messages, transforming them, sending them on to the next neurons. The next neurons do the same thing, and on and on and on through billions of neurons. And in our particular setting, we're going to say that these neurons are noisy. And so each neuron adds some degree of randomness, some degree of fluctuation to these messages. And so it brings something random to the table. Okay, so in a network like this, I'm going to talk about a rule, a strategy that might allow neurons to identify which connections are redundant and which connections can be kept. Okay, so here's the idea, and I'll kind of unfold the idea over the next few slides, giving you a few different perspectives. So the idea is each pair of neurons can compare their activity. I'm a neuron, you're a neuron. we're next to each other, we can sort of compare our activity. We can talk about biological mechanisms, if you like. And they effectively ask this question, how similar are we? Are we doing similar things? Are we going up and down together? And slightly more specifically, they're asking, are we more similar than you would expect given the strength of the connection between us? Let's say I have a sort of casual acquaintance. We don't have a strong connection, but it turns out we dress the same way, we like all the same music, we eat the same food for lunch. We probably have some degree of indirect influence. There's something else that's shaping both of us. It's not that they're getting it from me or I'm getting it from them. A similar intuition here. If these two neurons find that they're more similar than you would expect, given the strength of the direct connection, it probably means that there's information flowing through indirect routes. And that means that the connection is redundant and can be pruned. Okay, let me give you two perspectives on the same idea, just unpacking this idea. One will be slightly more mathy, slightly more technical, and then I'll use a social example after that in a couple of slides, and then I'll be done. Okay, so we came up with this pruning algorithm, which we call noise prune. And so you have neurons in a network. You drive the neurons with noise, so they're kind of randomly fluctuating a lot. So that's the two neurons we're considering. They have some connection between them, which we're going to call Wij. That's a mathematical subscript saying from ith neuron to jth neuron. Each pair of neurons computes a mathematical quantity called their covariance. The covariance is a measure of how much we go up and down together. If we're both going up and down together, we have positive covariance. If we're going up and down in opposite ways, we have negative covariance. If we're doing exactly the same thing, our covariance is big. If we're sort of doing the same thing, our covariance is small. So covariance, mathematical quantity that captures how similar we are. They then use this to compute a probability that you should keep the connection. And so bear with me, one equation. This is the probability that you should keep the connection between these two neurons. And it's proportional to this mathematical expression. This is the weight of the connection. And so it says, strong connections are still important. All else being equal, we want to be biased to keeping a strong connection. We also want to probe the structure of the network, but we should include the weight of the connection when we're deciding. They look at their so-called variance, basically a measure of how active each of them is. And so connections between more strongly activated neurons are important. And they subtract their covariance. And so if we're doing similar stuff, let's get rid of this connection. Okay, and so then with this probability, we either strengthen the neuron, the connection, we keep the connection and strengthen it, and these are like the persistent spines Karen talked about, or we get rid of it. So that's the algorithm. This is about as technical as I'll get. It's kind of a fun note just to talk about how mathematical ideas diffuse. You can actually prove that this works in models. And the tools to do this actually came about in quantum information theory in the late 90s and early 2000s and kind of slowly spread into theoretical neuroscience. It's kind of a fun illustration, I think, of how just theoretical frameworks spread. Okay, so we can build computer simulations that show that this idea works really well. Over here in black, I'm showing you simulations of activity from some network of neurons over time. And I'm comparing two ways of pruning the network. One, I just keep strong connections and throw away weak ones. And that does terribly. The activity of the network after pruning is very, very different. And this was our strategy, and it does really well. It stays close. And so we've gotten rid of connections in this network, but the network is still doing the same thing. It still is hanging on to the memories that it had learned. It still has learned the same associations and so on. Okay, so that got a little technical. And so for the last couple of slides, I'm going to try and give you a little bit more of a social example for why this strategy might be a good idea. Okay, so let's say, Marie is a popular lady. Let's say she's decided that she has too many friends and she needs to prune some of her connections. She wants to get rid of her friends, just like, kind of keep things downsized to a smaller set of friends, manage her social calendar. And so she's trying to decide whether she should stay friends with me. But she still wants to stay plugged into the whole network, hear all the good gossip, be able to influence people. And so what she's really trying to figure out is this connection with me redundant, or is it unique? Basically, if she gets rid of this connection with me, could she still hear what I'm up to through her network? Could she still influence me through her network? How could she do this? She needs to figure out, are her friends connected to me? Are her friends of friends connected to me? And so on. And she's not going to go and talk to all her friends and be like, do you know Rishi? No. Do any of your friends know Rishi? No. That's a complicated problem. So here's something she might do instead. She could spread a rumor about me. She could tell all her friends that I eat ice cream every day for breakfast. And so let's say she tells the other NeuroFest speakers that, she spreads it to Charan, she spreads it to Marty, she spreads it to Karen, and so on. And this is a noisy network. It's like a game of telephone. So each of them hears some variant on this. And so Charan heard Rishi eats cream for breakfast, Marty heard Rishi eats shrimp for breakfast, Karen heard Rishi eats, at daybreak. And then they continue, they spread on this rumor because they're all gossips, and so it kind of goes through their network. And at the end of the day, it finally does reach me. And the question is, and let's say I've heard a completely different thing than from what she sent. She said, I eat ice cream for breakfast. That seems reasonable. I hear that I scream at daybreak. Not reasonable for most people. So what has this told Marie? I've heard a highly distorted rumor, and she can figure out what I've heard because, I come to her and say, why did you say this? The fact that the rumor is highly distorted means that there are very few indirect connections between us. That this information had to really travel a long way before I heard it, and that's why it got so distorted along the way. And so that actually tells her that, no, the direct connection is important. I don't have a good way to reach Rishi without this direct connection. And so she should keep it, and I'm a very forgiving person, so we keep the connection. But imagine instead that she spreads this rumor, and I hear it really quickly, and I hear it pretty accurately. I heard, oh, I eat ice cream after breakfast, and she said, I eat ice cream for breakfast. Well, in that case, what probably happened was that there were a bunch of indirect connections. Karen came and told me straight away, this is what Marie's been saying about you. It was only one step. I heard it immediately. It's, I've heard this really accurately. That tells Marie that this direct connection was unnecessary. I can get rid of it. Because anything I want to hear about Rishi, Karen's going to tell me. Anything I want to say to Rishi, Karen's going to tell him. And so I could prune it. And that's kind of a social example for why this mathematical framework actually works. And I think it's a very intuitive one. It's like playing telephone. Okay, to summarize, I told you that pruning, the process of getting rid of connections, is crucial for development, learning, and efficiency. Disruptions of pruning are linked to various developmental and degenerative disorders. To me, there's this key algorithmic conceptual question, which connections do we prune? I introduced this idea that maybe noise helps identify redundant connections to prune, and I suggested a new algorithm. It's just an idea so far, using noise to prune a network. Okay, so this work was done in collaboration with Eli Moore, a very talented grad student who worked with me and is now faculty at Diablo Valley College. I'd like to thank the rest of my lab and the funding agencies, and thank you for your attention and for coming.
Questions for Dr. Chaudhuri?
Hey.
I wanted to ask, you're talking about how we learn and we have a process. And during COVID, children's ability to learn suffered. Is there any way to relate that to your research, from looking at it from a biological point of view versus the social?
Yeah, It feels like, we know, there's sort of things we know about learning, like, you learn better in sort of an enriching, stimulating environment. There's kind of this theme, I think, when people study lab animals, for example, if you put them in a very simple, basic environment, they're just not going to learn as much. They're not as stimulated. They're not as enriched. And so these kinds of naturalistic environments are really, really important for learning. Or, people have been studying decision-making in animals. And again, if you want to get a mouse or a rat to do something complex, you need to give it something that really matches its natural environment. And so I think anytime you take away a natural environment, you're sort of going to do much, much worse at learning. Now, whether that's specifically linked to disruptions of pruning or disruptions of new connections, I don't know. That would be kind of fascinating to study. I know like synaptic density is probably less when you have less of an enriched environment. But is that because you're not making as many new connections or because you're pruning too many? I don't know. It's a very interesting question.
Hello. I have a question about learning the same subject over and over. If you have a base knowledge in a subject, it's easier to remember what you've learned than something you've never studied before. How does that relate to what you're teaching us, please?
Yeah, so how does this kind of fact that, it's kind of a common experience. The first time you learn something, you don't quite learn it. You sort of learn it, and then it kind of goes away, and then you learn it better the next time, and so on. And maybe a little bit of insight from machine learning or AI. When people do pruning in these artificial neural networks, what they do is they actually do multiple cycles of learning and pruning. So you learn, and you mostly have it, but then you prune to try and make things efficient. But in the process of pruning, it's not perfect. And so pruning does take away, at least in AI, it does take away important connections. And so then you learn again, and you kind of put back those important connections, and you prune again, and you take away maybe some of those important. And so it's this kind of constant cycle, but each time it seems you get a little bit better at figuring out what are the really important connections. Because all of this is kind of this statistical, kind of noisy process. And so it's almost certainly the case that we take away important things while pruning. And so then you need multiple cycles.
I liked your example of the rumor in a social network, but I didn't understand your interpretation of it, because it seems like if there were a lot of indirect connections, you would have more distortion of the rumor as they came back, and if you had few, or I was distinguishing more between the length of the indirect paths. A longer path would have more distortion, and a shorter path would have less. It's like the old game of telephone.
Yeah, so there are kind of two, I think that's good intuition. There are kind of two factors we might think about. We might think about the length of the indirect path, and you're right that short paths would have less distortion, long paths will have more distortion. And then, in terms of number, because there's randomness, and because I'm averaging the messages I get, if they're like 3 indirect connections versus 300, if they're 300, all the randomness can get averaged out. It's like taking a survey. If I poll 3 people, I'm going to get much more noisy survey results. But if I poll 300, I have a hope of averaging away that noise. The same way if Marie sends a message and she sends it to 3 people and it reaches me versus 300 and it reaches me, even though the 300 people are all adding some noise, because of averaging, I'll actually get a more reliable message from the 300.
What is the probability of this being a random sort of process or an evolutionary process as compared to a divine intervention process?
As opposed to what? What was the last?
What's that?
Oh, you said random as opposed to?
Random or evolutionary process to have all this happen.
Yeah, so the way I've set it up, it looks pretty random. There's kind of just all sorts of noise spreading around. But I think it's probably more likely that there's something clever about the noise, that there's something clever about how this randomness is set up and how it propagates. For example, it seems like maybe there really are just very, very important connections, and we just don't prune those. Or maybe we turn up noise in neurons that are new or don't have a lot of connections because we don't know their job yet. And so, this in some sense is the big picture idea, but now I think you can go in and ask questions like, what are the statistics of the fluctuations that actually makes this the best possible pruning process? And I think that's a really fascinating theoretical question. It's also kind of a cool empirical question because then you can go in and you can say, let's just look at the noise in the brain. That, it's not purely random. It has some structure. Is that structure maybe matched to good pruning?
Thank you, Dr. Chaudhuri.
A good what? Oh, yeah. Yeah, no, right.
Thank you.
Cool. Thank you, everyone.